Chapter 11 of the Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Alec Datesman. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 11. Camillus. 1. About 380 years before the birth of Christ, the Romans had another war with the Veientians. During this war, they tried to take the rich city of Veii, which was about 12 miles from Rome. But there was a great wall of stone all around the city, and the gates, which were of brass, were very high and very strong. So the Romans, though they tried as hard as they could for 7 years, were not able to take Veii. And to make matters worse for them, it was reported that 12 Etruscan cities were going to send armies to help the Veientians. It was also said that as soon as the 12 armies had driven the Romans away from the walls of Veii, they would march to Rome and destroy the city. The Romans were much alarmed by these reports, and they resolved that there should be a dictator. So the Senate appointed a dictator, and the man appointed was Marcus Furius Camillus. Camillus was one of the greatest men of Rome. He belonged to a very rich and powerful family, and he was a great soldier. When he was made dictator, he raised a large army and marched at once to Veii. He tried a long time to break down the walls or gates, but he could not do it. Then he thought of the plan of digging a tunnel under the walls. This seemed a good idea, so Camillus set a great number of his men to work. Soon they had a tunnel dug under the walls, and so far under the city that they thought they were as far as the great temple of Juno, which was in the fort or strongest part of Veii. Here they stopped to consider what next to do. Suddenly the sound of voices, as of people talking in the temple above them, reached their ears. So they sent for Camillus, and when he came, he listened to the voices. Now it happened that at this moment the king of Veii was in the temple preparing to offer an ox as a sacrifice to Juno, and praying to the goddess to save the city from the Romans. The ox was killed, and its carcass was ready to be laid on the altar. After the king had prayed, one of the priests, pretending that he had received an answer from Juno, cried out, "The goddess declares she will give victory to him who offers this as a sacrifice upon the altar." As soon as Camillus, who was listening all the time, heard these words of the priest, he ordered his men to break an opening in the earth over their heads. This was quickly done, and the Romans sprang through into the midst of the worshippers. They at once seized the carcass of the ox, and Camillus himself offered it upon the altar to Juno. Then he and his companions rushed out of the temple and opened the gates of the city before the astonished and frightened people knew what was being done. As soon as the gates were opened, the Roman soldiers poured in by the thousands. The Veientians fought bravely, but they were quickly defeated, and their great and rich city was at last in the hands of the Romans. In those times, as has already been said, it was the custom to divide among the victorious soldiers the valuable things taken from a defeated enemy. The riches of Veii were, therefore, divided among the Roman soldiers, and there were so many precious things, gold and silver and jewelry, that the men were quite rich when each got his share. 2. Sometime after the taking of Veii, the Romans were at war with the Philicians and other people of Etruria, and Camillus went with an army to besiege their chief town, which was called Falerii. He made his camp in front of the walls, stationed soldiers all around, and tried hard to take the town. But the Philicians were very strong and brave, and they defended their town so well that Camillus began to be afraid he would not be able to take it at all. Now there was at the time in Falerii a schoolmaster who taught the sons of the chief citizens of the town. This schoolmaster used to take his boys every day for a walk outside the walls. One day he led them within the lines of the Roman army, and brought them into the camp of Camillus. Camillus was surprised at seeing the boys. He asked the schoolmaster who they were, and why he had brought them there. The schoolmaster told who the boys were, and then said, "I bring them here to give them up to you. In doing this, I give you up the city, for their fathers will surrender the city to you in order to get back their children." Camillus stood for a moment in silence, gazing at the traitor with a look of disgust. Then, in an angry voice, he cried out, "Villain! We Romans are not so base as you are. We do not make war upon children, but upon men who do us wrong." He then ordered some of his soldiers to tie the schoolmaster's hands behind his back, and to give each of the boys a rod, telling them to scourge the traitor before them into the city. This the boys did with a hearty good will. They whipped the unworthy schoolmaster into Falerii, and when the people saw the sight, and heard of the noble conduct of Camillus, they resolved not to fight any more against so good a man. So they sent ambassadors to Rome to make peace, and the Romans and Cilicians became good friends. 3. Not long after this time, one of the tribunes brought a charge against Camillus that he had kept for his own use more than his fair share of the spoils of Veii. Some valuable things were noticed in his house, and it was said that he had not got them as part of his share. It was believed, therefore, that he had taken them secretly from Veii. The Romans were very particular upon this point. They had strict laws for the division of spoils obtained in war, and no one was permitted to take more than he was entitled to, according to his rank in the army. Camillus was summoned to appear in the people's court to answer the charge made against him, but he would not humble himself so much as to go before the plebeians to be tried. He preferred rather to leave Rome forever. So the great Camillus departed from his native city, intending never to return. As he passed out of the gates, he prayed to the gods that some dreadful thing might happen to the Romans, so that they would be forced to call him back again to Rome to save the city. And very soon something did happen, which compelled the Romans to ask for the help of Camillus. For a long time a people called the Gauls had been doing a great deal of mischief in some parts of Italy. These people came from the country now known as France, which in ancient times was called Gaul. Thousands of them made their way across the high mountains called the Alps, and settled on the plains of northern Italy. For many years they lived in this region. Then they heard that further south the country was very beautiful, and was rich in corn and cattle, so they started out in great numbers to conquer it. They were a strange, savage people, very different from the Romans or the Etruscans. They were very tall and strong, and had long, shaggy black hair and dark, fierce faces, so that they appeared very terrible to the Italians. In battle they showed all their savage nature. They rushed furiously at their enemies, yelling at the top of their voices, flourishing enormous swords, and blowing trumpets. The chief or king of the Gauls at this time was called Brennus. He was a man of great strength and size. He wore a golden collar around his neck, and on his arms, which were bare, he sometimes wore bracelets of gold. The Gauls found the southern lands very much to their liking. They robbed farms, attacked some of the Etruscan cities, and then, after a short time, they marched for Rome. A great Roman army went out to fight them, and two armies met on the banks of a river called the Allia. The Roman soldiers had never before seen the dreadful Gauls. They were, therefore, greatly terrified when the tall, fierce-looking savages came running over the plains in vast numbers, shouting furiously and blowing their trumpets. And though the Roman general, Marcus Manlius, tried to make his men go forward bravely to meet the Gauls, it was useless. They fought badly and were killed by thousands. At last they ran from the field and fled toward Rome. 4. When the defeated soldiers reached Rome and told what had happened, there was great terror in the city. Most of the people bundled up their household goods and fled to hiding places in the mountains close by, where they thought they would be safe from the Gauls. But many of the senators and other brave men, both nobles and plebeians, instead of running away from the city, went up to the capital, fastened the gates, and made ready for a siege. The capital was the most sacred part of the city. It contained splendid statues of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, and, as you know, the famous Sibylline books. Some old men who had been consuls resolved to remain in the city and wait for the Gauls to come. They thought that if the Gauls should kill them, they would then be satisfied and would spare the city. So the patriotic old men dressed themselves in their finest robes and sat in chairs in the forum, each with an ivory staff in his right hand. When the Gauls reached the city, there was no one to oppose them. They marched on to the forum and found the old men, with long white beards, sitting in their chairs, so still that they looked like statues. A Gaul went up to one of them and pulled his beard to see if he were a living person. Instantly the old man raised his staff and struck the barbarian in the face. The Gauls then fell upon the patriots and killed them. Then they began to plunder. After destroying the greater part of the city, the Gauls turned their attention to the capital. The rock on which it was built was high and steep. Brennus led his soldiers up the hill, but the Romans in the capital rushed down the narrow road, and after a few minutes of brave fighting drove them back. The Gauls made another attempt, but it was no more successful than the first. Brennus saw that the Romans could not be driven from the capital. He therefore decided to starve them out. He put a strong guard at the entrance, so that the Romans could not come out to get food. For weeks the capital was thus besieged. but its faithful defenders held out manfully. Meanwhile, the people who had fled from Rome took courage again. They gathered at the city of Veii and organized a strong army to fight the Gauls. But they wanted a commander, and they thought of Camillus. All agreed that he would be the right man to be their general, so they resolved to send for him. But first they thought they must have the approval of the Senate. Here was a difficulty. How could a messenger get to the Senate while the Gauls were around the capital? This puzzled them for a good while, but at last a young man named Pontius Camillus volunteered to carry a message to the capital. So on a very dark night Pontius left Veii and swam down the Tiber until he reached the Capitoline hill. Then he went on shore and crept up the hill as far as the great rock. The Gauls had put no guard there, for they thought no one could climb the rock because it was so steep. By great efforts Pontius managed to climb up. Several times he was near falling, but by clinging to the vines and bushes that grew on the rock, he came to the top at last. His countrymen in the capital were delighted to see him. They were also very glad when they heard about the army at Veii, and the Senate at once approved of the proposal about Camillus. It was agreed not only to make him general, but to make him dictator. Then Camillus went down the rock and the hill by the way he had come up, and hastened off to Veii. 5. The next day, some of the Gauls, while walking along this side of the hill, noticed footmarks in the soil. They also noticed that bushes, growing high up on the rock, were crushed and torn. Then they knew that someone had gone up or come down the cliff, and they resolved to try to go up themselves that night. So shortly after midnight, when they thought that the Romans would be fast asleep, a party of Gauls began cautiously and silently to clamber up the steep rock. Some placed their shields across their shoulders for others to stand upon, and in this way they supported one another, until at last some of them made their way very near to the top, and one got just to the edge of a balcony of the Capitol. No one within the building heard them, not even the watchdogs. But at that moment there was a loud cackling of geese. These birds were thought to be favorite birds of the goddess Juno. Many were kept in the capital, and some of them happened just then to be at the side the Gauls were coming up. The movements of the climbers, quiet though they were, disturbed the geese, and they began to cackle and flap their wings. The noise aroused Marcus Manlius from his sleep. He sprang from his bed, seized his sword and shield, and ran to the balcony. There he saw a Gaul climbing onto the parapet, and others scrambling up behind. Marcus rushed upon him, struck him in the face with his shield, and tumbled him headlong down the rock. As the Gaul fell, he knocked down some of his companions who were climbing behind him. The geese still kept up their loud cackling, and soon all the Romans were awakened and came quickly to the assistance of Marcus. The Gauls were hurled back as they mounted the rock, and in a few minutes all who had come up were dashed down the steep cliff and killed. Thus the capital was saved by the cackling of geese. For his brave action on this occasion, Marcus Manlius was honored by being called Marcus Capitolinus. 6. Brennus now saw that he could not take the capital, so he thought it would be useless to remain any longer in Rome. He therefore offered to go away if the Senate would give him 1,000 pounds of gold. The Senate thought it better to do this. Food was very scarce in the capital, and in a few days the brave men there would have none at all. They had heard nothing further from the army at Veii, and they were not sure that help could come in time to save them. So the Senate resolved to give the 1,000 pounds in gold to the Gauls, and an officer named Quintus Sulpicius was sent with some lictors to deliver it to Brennus. But the gold had to be weighed, and the Gauls attempted to cheat the Romans by using false weights. When Sulpicius complained of this, Brennus took off his sword and threw it, belt and all, into one of the scales, and when Sulpicius asked what that meant, Brennus answered, "What should it mean but woe to the conquered?" At that moment Camillus appeared at the gates with his army. He soon learned what was going on. Quickly he marched to the spot and ordered the lictors to take the gold out of the scale and carry it back to the Roman treasury. Then he turned to Brennus, and, addressing him in a stern voice, said, "We Romans defend our country, not with gold, but with steel." Immediately there was a battle, and the Gauls were defeated and driven out of the city. Next day there was another battle a few miles from Rome, and the Gauls were again defeated, and thousands of them slain. Camillus then returned to Rome at the head of his victorious army. The people received him with shouts of joy, and for several days they had celebrations in his honor. They called him the second Romulus, meaning that he was the second founder of the city. They also called him the father of his country. 7. It was in the time of Camillus that a great hole or chasm, caused perhaps by an earthquake, suddenly appeared in the ground in the middle of the forum. Workmen were sent to fill it up, but no matter how much earth they threw into it, the hole seemed to be as large and deep as before. The Senate then consulted the augurs, and they said the hole could not be filled up until what was most valuable in Rome was cast into it. Then the people began to throw in gold and silver and jewelry, but still the hole was as deep as ever. At last a young man named Curtius said that the most valuable things the Romans had were their arms and their courage. Then he put on his armor and his sword, and mounting his horse, rode into the forum and leaped into the great hole. Immediately it closed up behind him, and neither he nor his horse was ever seen again. In the old Roman stories, Curtius is much praised as a patriot and hero. The people thought he had saved his country from some great evil, which they believed would have happened to it if the hole in the forum had not been closed up. End of Chapter 11. Recorded by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York. Of the Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Alec Datesman. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 12. Manlius Torquatus. Marcus Manlius, who commanded the Roman army at the Battle of Allia, and who so well defended the capital against the Gauls, belonged to a family known as the Manlii. This family gave many brave generals to the Republic. One of them was named Titus Manlius. Some years after the siege of the capital, Titus had a remarkable fight with a huge Gaul. The Gauls had come back to make war again upon Rome. Their army was encamped near a bridge on the Anio, a small river a few miles from the city, and the Roman army sent to oppose them was on the other side of the river, waiting for a good opportunity for battle. Every day a Gaul of gigantic size, who wore round his neck a chain of twisted gold threads, used to come to the bridge to insult the Romans. He would call them cowards who were afraid to fight. One day he dared them to send someone out to fight with him. Manlius at once accepted the challenge, and the two immediately took their places in an open space within sight of both armies. The Gaul was so tall and strong that the Roman appeared like a boy beside him, and everybody thought the big warrior would have an easy victory. But Titus was very quick in his movements. For a few moments after the fight began, he skillfully dodged the furious blows of his opponent. Then he suddenly ran up close to him, sprang under his great shield, and plunged his sword deep into the Gaul's body. The Gaul fell to the ground dead. Then Titus took the golden collar from the dead man's neck and put it on his own. So afterwards he was called Manlius Torquatus, from the word torque, which is Latin for a twisted collar. Manlius Torquatus became consul, but he was not much liked by the people, for he was a very stern and severe ruler. During a war which the Romans had with the Latins and some tribes of South Italy, Manlius was in command of the Roman army. He marched to meet the enemy, who were assembled in force at the foot of Mount Vesuvius. While the two armies were encamped opposite to each other, Manlius ordered that none of his men should fight with any of the Latins until the word for battle was given. Soon after, a Latin officer met young Manlius, the consul's son, riding in front of the lines with a troop of his comrades. They entered into conversation about the coming battle, and each boasted of the valor of the soldiers on his own side. At last, the Latin officer challenged the young Roman to a single combat. "Wilt thou," he cried, "measure thy strength with mine? It will then be seen how much the Latin horseman excels the Roman." Manlius accepted the challenge, and in the fight which immediately took place, he was the victor. He killed the Latin, and, according to the custom of those times, stripped him of his armor and carried it to the Roman camp. Then he went to tell his father what he had done. "Father," said he, "I present you this armor, which I have taken from the enemy. I hope you will accept it as a proof that I am ready and able to do my duty as a Roman soldier." Torquatus looked at his son sadly, and then said, "My son, you say you are willing to do your duty as a soldier, but the first duty of a soldier is obedience. This duty you have not performed, for you have just now disobeyed me, your commander. You have fought with the enemy without receiving orders to do so, but you shall not escape punishment because you are my son." Then, turning to his lictors, he said, "Go, bind him to a stake, and cut off his head." At this cruel order, loud cries of horror came from the soldiers. Young Manlius threw himself at his father's feet and begged for mercy. But the stern consul turned away from him and ordered the lictors to perform their duty. So the brave young Manlius was led to a stake and bound, and with one stroke of the lictor's axe his head was cut from his body. Soon afterwards there was a battle between the two armies, and the Romans gained a great victory. But the war continued for some time longer. It ended, however, in the defeat of the Latins. Manlius took possession of one of their towns, the town of Antium, on the Mediterranean coast, and compelled the inhabitants to give up their warships. War vessels and galleys in those times had sharp prows made for the purpose of running into and breaking through the sides of other vessels. The prow was a beam with pointed irons fastened to it, and a metal figure resembling the beak or head of a bird or other animal. The beak was called a rostrum. When the Romans captured the warships of Antium, they broke off the beaks and carried them to Rome. There they fastened them as ornaments to the platform in the Forum, from which orators addressed the people. Hence the word rostrum came to mean a platform or pulpit for public speaking, and in this sense it is now used in our own language. End of Chapter 12. Recorded by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York. Of the Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Alec Datesman. Famous Men of Rome, by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 13. Appius, Claudius, Caecus. 1. Soon after the defeat of the Gauls, there lived in Rome a great man named Appius Claudius. He belonged to one of the highest families of the city. He was consul for 2 years, and for several years he held the office of censor, from 312 to 308 B.C. The censor was a very high and important officer. He was not only head of the department for taking the census, but he had charge of the collecting of the taxes, the erecting of public buildings, and the making of roads and streets. Appius Claudius was a great soldier. Every Roman citizen had to be a soldier, and every man who was consul had to be able to lead armies and to fight and win battles. But Appius Claudius was chiefly famous for the great public works he planned and directed in Rome, which at that time was a city with a population of about 300,000. One of these works was an aqueduct, which brought water to the city from a lake 8 miles distant. The Roman aqueducts were the best in the world. Some of them that were built over 2,000 years ago are still in use. But the greatest work of Appius Claudius was the making of a road from Rome to Capua, a distance of 120 miles. This road was called the Appian Way, in honor of Appius. It was also called the Queen of Roads, because it was so well built. Parts of it are still in existence. The Romans had good roads as well as good aqueducts. They were the best road builders in the world. While he was censor, Appius Claudius very much improved Rome. He was called the greatest of his countrymen in the works of peace. Even after he retired from office, he had great influence in public affairs. His advice was asked by both plebeians and nobles. Once, during the first war which the Romans had with the Greeks, the advice of Appius was of great benefit to Rome. At that time there were many Greek settlements in the south of Italy. One of the Greek towns was called Tarentum. It was built close to the sea, and had a very good harbor. Many of the people of this town were well educated. In those days, the Greeks were mostly an educated people. They were fond of learning and of art. They called the Romans barbarians, and were not friendly to them. Once when a Roman fleet entered the bay of Tarentum, the people of the town attacked it, and after taking 5 of the ships, put the crews to death. When the news of this outrage reached Rome, the Senate sent ambassadors to demand satisfaction. One of the ambassadors was a man named Lucius Postumius. When they arrived at Tarentum, they were met by a noisy crowd of people of the town, who made fun of their dress. The Romans wore an outer dress called a toga. It was a large white woolen cloth, in the shape of a half circle, 4 or 5 yards long, and of nearly the same width. In putting on this garment, they doubled it lengthwise, then passed one end over the left shoulder and under the opposite arm, and again over the left shoulder, the other end reaching nearly to the ground in front. The Tarentines laughed at the toga of the Roman ambassadors. They said it was a dress fit only for savages. In a short time the ambassadors were taken to the public theatre, where the people had assembled to hear the message from Rome. Postumius spoke to them in Greek, but as this was not his own language, he pronounced many of the words in a peculiar way, and the Tarentines laughed. The Roman went on, however, in a dignified manner, and finished his speech as if he had not noticed the insult. Just then a Tarentine moved forward to the place where Postumius stood, and threw some dirt on his white toga. The ambassador held up the soiled garment with his hand, and said that Tarentum would be made to suffer for the outrage. Then the theatre rang with laughter and offensive cries. "Laugh on," said Postumius. "You may laugh now, but you shall weep hereafter. The stain on this toga shall be washed out in your blood." Then the ambassadors left the theatre, and at once set out for Rome. When they appeared before the Senate, Postumius showed the stain on his toga as proof of the insult offered to Rome by the Tarentines. The Senate at once declared war on Tarentum, and sent a powerful army to attack it. 2. At this time the Tarentines had no general they thought would be able to fight the Romans, so they sent across the sea to Pyrrhus, in Greece, for the king of that country to come and help them. The name of this king was Pyrrhus. He was a great soldier and commander, and was nearly always engaged in war. He consented to help the Tarentines, and crossed over to Italy with a great army, in which there was a number of fighting elephants. When Pyrrhus entered Tarentum, he made himself master of the city. The Tarentines were very fond of plays and amusements of all kinds. Pyrrhus closed the theatres, stopped all the amusements, and made the people drill as soldiers all day long. As soon as he was ready to fight, he marched out with his army of Greeks and Tarentines against the Romans, and there was a great battle near the city of Heraclea. Both sides fought well for hours, but the Greeks at last began to fall back. They could not stand against the steady, fierce attacks made by the Romans. Then Pyrrhus brought his elephants upon the field. He had 70 of them, and they were thoroughly trained to fight. They would run into the ranks of the enemy, knock the soldiers down, and trample them to death, or lay hold of them with their trunks, and throw them high into the air. As the elephants stood in line waiting for the order to charge, the Romans looked at them with wonder and fear. They knew nothing about elephants, for they had never seen any before, and when the huge beasts came charging furiously across the field, making strange noises, many of the Roman soldiers were terribly frightened and began to run away. The elephants killed hundreds of them, and in a few minutes the Roman army was put to flight. It was saved from entire destruction by only one thing. A Roman soldier was brave enough to rush at an elephant while it was charging and cut off a part of its trunk with his sword. The animal, wild with pain, turned and ran back to the Greek lines, trampling down the soldiers and causing a great deal of confusion. In the excitement, the Romans managed to escape across a river to a friendly city where they were safe. Pyrrhus won the victory, but he lost thousands of men. When he saw the great number of his soldiers that lay dead on the field, he exclaimed, "A few more such victories, and I must return to Epirus alone." 3. Shortly after the battle, Pyrrhus sent his friend and favorite minister, Cineas, to Rome to offer terms of peace to the Senate. Cineas was a very eloquent man. Often when Pyrrhus could not conquer people in battle, Cineas by his clever speeches induced them to submit to the king and be his friends. This was why the Greeks used to say, "The tongue of Cineas wins more cities than the sword of Pyrrhus." Cineas proposed to the Roman Senate that the Romans should not make war any longer on the Tarentines, nor on any of the Italian tribes that had helped them, and that all the lands Rome had taken from these tribes in past years should be given back. If the Romans would agree to these terms, then Pyrrhus would be their true friend. The terms were not so good for Rome, but Cineas was so smooth-spoken and so pleasant in proposing them that many of the senators were inclined to accept them. One day while they were discussing the matter in the Senate, a thrilling scene occurred. Appius Claudius was still living in Rome. He was very old and had become blind. For this reason he got the name Caecus, a word which is Latin for blind. But his mind was remarkably clear, and he had not lost interest in public affairs. When he heard that the Senate was going to accept the terms offered by Pyrrhus, he rose from his bed declaring that he would go and speak against the proposal. So he was carried by his slaves to the Senate house, and his sons led the aged man to his seat. He began his speech amidst the deepest silence. His youth seemed to come back to him. Once more he was the bold censor of 30 years before. In fiery words he spoke against the plan for peace, saying it would be base and cowardly to yield to the Greek king. "Let us fight on," he said, "as long as we have soldiers. Shall we submit to this Greek invader merely because we have lost one battle? Never, never, I say. Better to lose all that we have than to disgrace ourselves by submitting." The patriotic old man went on speaking in this way until his strength failed him, and he sank exhausted into his seat. His speech had so much effect on the senators that they immediately voted against the proposal of Pyrrhus and ordered Cineas to depart from Rome. Then the war was carried on vigorously. A great battle was fought at Asculum, and again the Romans were defeated by the Greeks, but they were not discouraged. The consul Curtius Dentatus fought another battle against Pyrrhus at Beneventum, and won a glorious victory. The Greeks were utterly defeated, and Pyrrhus soon afterwards left Italy and returned to his own country. Then the Romans speedily took possession of Tarentum, and made its people pay well for their insult to the Roman ambassadors. End of Chapter 13. Recorded by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York. Of Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Alec Datesman. Famous Men of Rome, by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 14. Regulus. 1. The next great war the Romans engaged in was with Carthage. It was about the possession of the island of Sicily, in the Mediterranean Sea. It began not long after Pyrrhus left Italy, and was the first of 3 wars called the Punic Wars. Punic means Phoenician, and the people who founded Carthage came from Phoenicia, so Carthage was called a Punic or Phoenician colony. When the first Punic War began, both Rome and Carthage were very rich and powerful. Rome had great armies and great generals. Its common soldiers, too, were remarkably brave and patriotic. It was very successful in its wars. Before it began to fight Carthage, it had conquered nearly all Italy. Carthage also had fine armies, but its greatest strength was in its navy. No other country in the world at that time had so many ships of war and trading ships. The ships of the Carthaginians went everywhere in the Mediterranean. Some of them even went past the Pillars of Hercules, as the rocky capes at the Strait of Gibraltar were then called, and sailed for some distance on the Atlantic Ocean. The Carthaginian ships were small, but they were very strong. The warships were built to carry a good many soldiers, as well as sailors and oarsmen. They had great rounded iron prows, which could do much damage to an enemy's ships when run up against them. Each ship had a mast and a large sail, but it was also rowed with oars by many oarsmen, who sat on long benches, placed one above the other. With the sail and the oars the ship could be made to go very fast through the water. Carthage was in North Africa, in the country now called Tunis. It stood at the head of a beautiful bay of the Mediterranean. It was a large and handsome city, and had a great commerce. 2. Many years before the beginning of the First Punic War, Carthage conquered a great part of Sicily, and made it a Carthaginian colony. But the Romans wanted the island, and so under the pretense of protecting an Italian tribe that had settled there, they sent an army into Sicily. This was how the First Punic War began. Both Rome and Carthage fought fiercely, and for a long time neither had much advantage over the other. At first the Romans had no warships. Up to that time they did not need any, for all their fighting was on land. But when they began war with the Carthaginians, they found that they must have ships to carry their soldiers to Sicily, and to fight the Carthaginians at sea. So the Romans set to work to build ships, and to train men to row them, and in a short time they had a great navy. In the 9th year of the war, the armies and fleets of Rome were put under the command of a general named Marcus Atilius Regulus. He was a great hero and patriot. He had been a general before the Punic War, and had often led the Romans to victory. After years of good service, fighting and winning battles for his country, he went to live on his little farm, and, like Cincinnatus, he cultivated it with his own hands. A story is told of him well which illustrates ancient Roman honor and patriotism. Until Regulus took command, the Punic War was carried on only in Sicily and on the Mediterranean, but he thought that Rome should fight the Carthaginians in their own country, and so he organized an immense army and navy to invade Carthage. He had 330 warships of the largest size and about 60,000 soldiers. In those times, in fights at sea, they had an engine called a boarding bridge. On one end it was fixed to the deck of the ship. The other end, which was free, could be swung round and onto an enemy's ship, and it had a heavy iron spike underneath, so that when it fell on the deck it would sink into it, and thus hold the enemy's vessel for the attacking party to board it. When everything was ready, Regulus set sail for Africa. Soon after starting, he met a large Carthaginian fleet, and in a short battle he destroyed it. Then he sailed on, and after landing in Africa began a march toward Carthage. On his way he captured several towns, and he met and defeated a Carthaginian army. He then continued his march until he met another army of Carthaginians. This army was commanded by Xanthippus, a famous general of Sparta, in Greece, who happened to be in Carthage at that time. In the battle that followed, the Romans were defeated, and Regulus was made prisoner and taken off to Carthage. 3. But the Romans had other generals and other armies, and they carried on the war and defeated the Carthaginians in many battles. At last the Carthaginians thought it better to try to make peace, and so they sent ambassadors to Rome to propose that the war should be stopped on certain terms, which they were ready to offer. They sent Regulus with the ambassadors, but they made him swear that he would return to Carthage if the Roman Senate should refuse to agree to their terms. They thought that in order to gain his own freedom, Regulus would try to get the Senate to accept their proposals. Regulus agreed to go, and made the promise required. "I will give you my word of honor," said he, "that I will return if your terms are not accepted." Then he set out for Rome with the ambassadors. As he approached the gates of the city, thousands of people came forth to welcome him and to escort him through the streets, but he refused to enter. "I cannot enter Rome," said he. "I am no longer a Roman officer, but a prisoner of Carthage. Do not urge me to enter the gates. I am not even worth exchanging for a Carthaginian prisoner." The people, however, insisted that he should enter the city, and so amid shouts and cheers he was escorted to the Senate house. In a little while the Carthaginian ambassadors presented their proposals, and the Senate began to consider them. After some discussion, Regulus was asked to give his opinion whether the terms ought to be accepted or not. Regulus at first was unwilling to speak in the Senate. He said that by becoming a prisoner he had lost the honor of being a senator. "I am no longer a Roman senator," said he. "I am a prisoner of Carthage." The Senate, however, insisted that he should speak. Then Regulus said that the Senate ought not to accept the terms of peace offered by Carthage. He thought that they were not good terms for Rome, and he advised the Senate not to agree to them. But the Senate was inclined to accept the terms for the sake of Regulus himself. If peace were not made, he would have to go back and remain a prisoner in Carthage, or perhaps he would be put to death. Therefore the Senate was for agreeing to the Carthaginian terms, but Regulus again spoke strongly against them, and at last the Senate decided to reject the Carthaginian proposals. 4. Regulus now prepared to return to Carthage, but his family and friends clung to him, saying, "You must not go! You must not go!" To all their appeals he made but one answer: "I have given my word of honor to return, and I cannot break it." So Regulus returned to Carthage with the ambassadors. When the people of that city heard that by his advice their terms had been rejected, they were very angry. They had wished very much to make peace with Rome, for the long war had cost them a great many lives and a great deal of money, and they wanted to stop it. Therefore they were enraged against Regulus, and they put him to death in a very cruel way. The war between Rome and Carthage continued for some years more, but at last the Carthaginians were defeated in a great sea battle near the coast of Sicily. They were then obliged to give up Sicily and pay a large sum of money to the Romans as a fine. This was the end of the First Punic War, 241 BC. End of Chapter 14. Recorded by Alec Datesman, Brooklyn, New York.
Chapter 15 of The Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chanel Jackson. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 15. Scipio Africanus. But peace did not last long between Rome and Carthage. Some years after the end of the First Punic War, the Carthaginians attacked and took possession of a town in Spain, the people of which were friends and allies of Rome. This caused the Second Punic War, which began in BC 218. One of the great soldiers of this war was Publius Cornelius Scipio. In the latter part of his life he was called Scipio Africanus, on account of the great victories which he won in Africa. Scipio was a brave soldier from his youth. When only 17 years old, he fought in a battle and saved his father's life. He was always gallant and heroic in war, so he soon became noted in the Roman army and rose to high rank. And although he was a member of a noble family, he was well liked by the plebeians, and they elected him aedile. The aediles were magistrates or judges. There were also superintendents of the public buildings and of games and shows of which the Roman people were so fond. When Scipio was about 27 years of age, he was appointed to command the Roman army that was fighting the Carthaginians in Spain. Carthage had conquered some parts of Spain, and Rome had conquered other parts, and the two nations were often at war about places in that country. When Scipio went to Spain, many of the people there were against him, but they soon became his friends. Whenever he took a city, he allowed the chiefs who were captured to go free. He gave presents to many of them. He always showed great respect to women and children who were taken prisoners. In those times it was the cruel custom to make slaves of women who were found in towns that had been taken in war, but Scipio never did this in Spain. He always let the women go free. One day, a beautiful Spanish girl who had been taken prisoner was brought before him. She seemed very much frightened, but Scipio spoke kindly to her and told her that no one should harm her. While speaking with her, he learned that a young man who was her lover had also been taken prisoner by the Roman soldiers. He sent for the young man and said to him, "Take your sweetheart and go. I set you both free. Go and be happy, and in future be friends of Rome." And so by many acts of kindness Scipio gained the friendship of the Spaniards. After a while they began to join the Romans and gave them great help in their war against the Carthaginians. When his services were no longer needed in Spain, Scipio returned to Rome. He got a great reception in the city. There was a grand parade in his honor. He brought home an immense quantity of silver, which he obtained from the rich Spanish mines and from the cities he had taken. The silver was put into the Roman treasury to pay the expenses of the war. Soon after he returned from Spain, Scipio was elected consul. The Carthaginian general, Hannibal, was then in Italy with a large army. This Hannibal was one of the greatest generals of ancient times. When he was but 9 years old, his father, who was also a great general, made him take an oath that he would hate Rome and the Romans forever. He took the boy with him to Spain and gave him a thorough training as a soldier. When his father died, Hannibal became commander of the Carthaginian army in Spain. He was then little more than 21 years old. He fought well in Spain for some time, and was well liked by his soldiers. Suddenly he resolved to make war on the Romans in their own country, and go by land to Italy. So he got ready an immense army, and set out on his march. In passing through France, he had to cross the broad river Rhone. This was not easy to do, for there was no bridge. He got his men over in boats, but he had a number of elephants in his army, and they were too big and heavy to be taken across in that way. The boats were small, and the elephants were afraid to go into them. Hannibal therefore got rafts, or floats, made of trunks of trees tied together, and in these the elephants were carried over. Crossing the Rhone, Hannibal marched over the Alps into Italy. He and his army suffered many hardships in taking their way over those snow-covered mountains. He had often to fight fierce tribes that came to oppose him, but he defeated them all, and after being defeated, many of them joined his army and brought him provisions for his soldiers. Very soon Roman armies were sent against Hannibal, but he defeated them in many battles. Once his army got into a place near high hills, where he could not march further except through one narrow pass between the hills. The Roman general, Quintus Fabius, sent 400 of his troops to take possession of this pass, and he posted the rest of his army on the hills close by. Hannibal saw that he was in a trap, but he found a way of escaping. He caused vine branches to be tied to horns of a large number of the oxen that were with his army. Then he ordered his men to set the branches on fire in the middle of the night, and to drive the oxen up the hills. As soon as the animals felt the pain, they rushed madly about and set fire to the shrubs and bushes they met on the way. The Romans at the pass thought that the Carthaginians were escaping by torchlight, so they hastily quit their posts and hurried towards the hills to help their comrades. Then Hannibal, seeing the pass free, marched his army out and so escaped from the trap. Quintus Fabius was very slow and cautious in his movements. The Romans had been defeated so often that he thought the best plan was to harass Hannibal in every possible way, but not to venture to fight him in a great battle until he should be sure of winning. For this reason the Romans gave Fabius the name of Contactor, which means delayer, and so the plan of extreme delay or caution in any undertaking is often called a Fabian policy. But in spite of the caution of Fabius, Hannibal gained many great victories. His greatest victory was at the Battle of Cannae in the south of Italy. Here he defeated and destroyed a Roman army of 7,000 men, and for several years after this battle Hannibal remained in Italy, doing the Romans all the harm he could. At last Scipio thought it was time to follow the plan of Regulus, so he said to the Senate, "We have acted too long as if we were afraid of Hannibal and Carthage. We defend ourselves bravely when we are attacked, and so far we have saved Rome from destruction. But we do not make any attacks of our own. We certainly ought to do this, for our armies are strong and fully ready to meet the Carthaginians." Scipio then proposed that an army led by himself should go to Africa and carry on war there. He believed that if this were done, Hannibal would have to go to Africa to defend Carthage. Perhaps on account of what had happened to Regulus, the Senate did not like Scipio's plan. Nevertheless, it gave him permission to go to Africa, but would not give him an army. Scipio then raised a splendid army of volunteers and sailed across the Mediterranean Sea to Africa. Scipio tried for some time to obtain the aid of Syphax, a powerful king of Numibia in Africa, but Syphax decided to join the Carthaginians. So Scipio found two great armies ready to fight him. One was the army of Carthage, with 33,000 men commanded by Hasdrubal Gisco, and the other was the army of Numibia, with 60,000 men commanded by King Syphax. But Scipio found in Africa one strong friend, and that was a Numidian prince named Massinissa. This prince had a host of supporters among his countrymen, and was therefore able to bring a large force of good soldiers to the aid of the Romans. He was of great service to Scipio in many ways. When everything was ready, the Roman army, with Massinissa's force, encamped about 6 miles from the camps of the enemy. Scipio sent spies among the Carthaginians and the soldiers of King Syphax. From then he learned that both armies were lodged in huts made of stakes and covered with reeds and dried leaves. He resolved to set those huts on fire. So one very dark night the Roman army left its camp and marched silently to the plain occupied by the army. Then a division of the Romans went to the encampment of the Numidians, and a soldier crept cautiously from the Roman lines and set one of the huts on fire. The fire spread rapidly, and in a few minutes the whole camp was in flames. The Numidian soldiers, suddenly awakened by the fire, fled from the burning huts without their weapons, and made frantic efforts to escape from the camp. Hundreds of them were knocked down and trampled to death in the rush and confusion. Hundreds more lost their lives in the fire. Those who got to the open country were attacked by the Romans and killed. The ground was covered with the bodies of the slain. King Syphax and a few horsemen managed to escape, but the rest of the vast Numidian army was destroyed. In the meantime, the Carthaginians had been aroused by the noise in the camp of the Numidians. They thought that the fire had been caused by an accident, and some of them ran forward to assist the Numidians, but the greater number stood in a confused throng without their arms outside their camp, looking at the fire with terror. While they were in this helpless state, the Carthaginians were suddenly attacked by the Romans, with Scipio at their lead. Many were killed, and the others were driven back into their camp, which was immediately set on fire in a number of places. Then there was a frightful scene. Thousands of Carthaginians, struggling to escape the fire, were slain by the Romans, while thousands more perished in the flames. Hasdrubal Gisco, the commander, and some of his officers escaped, but only a few of the others. In less than an hour there was little left of the Carthaginian army. Scipio now began to march towards the great rich city of Carthage. He captured a number of towns and a great deal of treasure. In a few weeks, however, the Carthaginians were able to form another army of 30,000 men, and they came boldly forth to meet Scipio. A fierce battle followed. The Romans were driven back for a time, but with wonderful courage they charged the Carthaginians again and again, and at last totally defeated them. The Carthaginians now sent a message to Italy, requesting Hannibal to come to the relief of his country. The renowned general did not want to leave Italy, for he hoped to be able to take Rome, but he thought it best to obey the call of Carthage, so he sailed for Africa with his army. After arriving in Africa, Hannibal led his army to a wide plain near Zama, a town not far from Carthage. Here he awaited the Romans. Hannibal had great admiration for Scipio, and he desired to see him before engaging in battle, so he sent a messenger to Scipio requesting an interview. The request was granted, and the two generals met. They greeted each other cordially, and each complimented the other on his victories and greatness as a soldier. Then Hannibal proposed terms of peace to Scipio. "We will give Spain and the islands of Sicily and Sardinia to Rome. Then we will divide the sea with you. What more could you have? Rome and Carthage would then be the two great nations of the world." Scipio thought it was too late to take terms. "We must fight it out," he said, "until one side or the other is vanquished." The generals then parted, and the next day the two armies were drawn up in battle array. On each side there were about 30,000 men, but Hannibal had a herd of fighting elephants. The battle was long and severe, but armies fought heroically, and there was terrible slaughter. But Hannibal's elephants were of little use to him, as the Romans frightened them by throwing trumpets and hurling balls of fire at them. At a moment when the lines of the Carthaginians were breaking, a strong force of Roman horsemen came up suddenly in the rear and overpowered all before it. This won the battle for the Romans. When Hannibal saw that the battle was lost, he fled from the field with a few friends. Scipio was now master of Carthage. He compelled the Carthaginians to pay him a vast amount of gold and silver, and to give up some of their towns and land. He also compelled them to destroy their great fleet of warships, and to promise not to make war in future upon any people without the permission of the Romans. When Scipio returned to Rome, he entered the city at the head of a grand procession. The greatest honors were paid to him, and he was called Scipio Africanus. Some years afterwards, Scipio met Hannibal at the court of the king of Syria. The two generals had a friendly conversation, and Scipio asked Hannibal who he thought was the greatest general that ever lived. Hannibal answered, "Alexander the Great." "Who was the second?" asked Scipio. "Pyrrhus," replied Hannibal. "Who the third?" "Myself," answered Hannibal. "But what would you have said if you had conquered me?" "I should then have said," replied Hannibal, "that I was greater than Alexander, greater than Pyrrhus, and greater than all other generals." End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of the Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chanel Jackson. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 16. Cato the Censor. On a farm near Tusculum, a little town about 15 miles from Rome, there once lived a boy named Marcus Porcius Cato. His father and his grandfather before him had been farmers, and he too expected to be one. When he was about 17, Hannibal's army crossed the Alps into Italy, and young Cato became a Roman soldier. When the war ended, the country boy had become a man, stern and forceful. He attracted the attention of a neighbor, a rich man who persuaded him to go to Rome and practice law. In time he was elected to office, and he did his duty so well that he rose higher and higher until he became one of the consuls. That same year a rebellion arose in Spain, and Cato led an army against the Spaniards. It is said that in 400 days he captured 400 villages. On his return to Rome he was honored with a triumph. Shortly after this he was sent to Greece, where Antiochus was attacking Greek cities that were friendly to Rome. He defeated Antiochus in the pass of Thermopylae, and won great fame as a soldier. Cato was a very hard man, hard on himself, hard on his friends, and although he was rich and held office in a great city, he lived a hard life, taking no pleasures and saving his money. He ate the plainest food and drank the same cheap wine that he bought for his slaves. He thought that the luxury and extravagance of the rich were taking away the strength of Rome. In order to put a stop to these things, Cato asked the people of Rome to elect him censor. The patricians opposed him bitterly, but he was elected by a large majority. One of the first things he did was to expel from the Senate several senators who were leading improper lives. He had a heavy tax put on carriages, so that as to compel people to walk. He also placed a tax on jewels, handsome dresses, carpets, and fine furniture. So well did he do his work that he is always known in history as Cato the Censor, just as if he were the only man who ever held the office. A statue erected in his honor says nothing about his victories in Spain or at Thermopylae, but only that, when the Roman Republic was degenerating, Cato restored it by strict discipline. In the later years of his life, Cato was sent to Carthage to look into a certain matter for Rome. The trouble was this. You will remember that Carthage had agreed to make war upon no nation without the consent of the Roman Senate. A few years later, Massinissa, who was a friend of Rome, attacked the Carthaginians, and they appealed to Rome for protection. This was refused, and the people of Carthage took up arms to defend themselves against Massinissa. Cato was sent to Carthage to find out who was to blame. When he arrived in the city, he was surprised to find it large and strong and flourishing. Only 26 years had passed since Scipio Africanus had conquered Carthage, and yet Cato saw crowds of men on the streets, stack of arms in the arsenals, and a forest of masts in the harbor. The city itself was rich and prosperous. Cato returned to Rome and warned his countrymen that Carthage must be destroyed. From that time forward, whenever he made a speech in the Senate, no matter upon what subject, he always ended it by saying, "And my opinion is that Carthage must be destroyed." In time, the words of Cato had their effect, and war was declared against Carthage. The troops had already embarked when envoys from Carthage reached Rome and offered to do whatever might be asked. The Roman Senate promised that the laws and liberties of Carthage should not be touched, but demanded hostages. So 300 children of the leading families of Carthage were sent to Rome. When the Roman army reached Carthage, the consuls insisted that the Carthaginians should give up their arms. This was done, and the Carthaginians asked if the Romans required any anything more. Then one of the consuls said, "Your city must be destroyed, and you must move 10 miles inland from the sea." The Carthaginians now saw that they had been deceived. They closed their gates, and determined to defend themselves to the last. They asked an armistice of 30 days, so that an embassy might go to Rome. It was granted, and thus a month of time was gained. During this time men, women, and children went to work to make arms to defend their homes. The women even cut their hair to furnish strings for the bows of the war machines with which stones were hurled at the enemy. The embassy failed in its mission to Rome, and the siege of Carthage began. It lasted 3 years. The son of Paulus, Manlius, had been adopted by the son of Scipio Africanus, and had taken the name Scipio. He was sent to Carthage, and about a year after his arrival forced an entrance into the city and captured it. The walls were torn down and the buildings set on fire. Cato, who was so largely responsible for the war, did not live to see its end. He died almost 2 years before the city was destroyed. The Senate honored Scipio with the title Africanus, which the older conqueror of Carthage had borne. The young Scipio won fame not only in Africa, but also in Spain, where he was sent against the Numantians. These brave people had defeated 2 Roman armies, but Scipio soon succeeded in shutting them within the walls of Numantia. Around its walls he built walls of his own, behind which his soldiers were safe from attack. Food soon became scarce in Numantia. At the end of 15 months the citizens were starving. They were willing to lose their lives, but Scipio stayed behind his own walls and refused to fight. Rather than trust the mercy of Rome, the Numantians killed themselves. In time, all Spain was forced to submit and became a Roman province. End of chapter 16. Cato the Censor. Chapter 17 of the Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Chanel Jackson. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 17. The Gracchi. Between the Second and Third Punic Wars, there lived in Rome 2 brothers named Tiberius and Caius Gracchus, commonly known as the Gracchi. They were very good men and great friends with the common people. The mother of the Gracchi was Cornelia, a daughter of Scipio Africanus. She was an excellent woman, and she was very proud of her 2 sons. She taught them to be brave and manly, and always to stand up for the people. One day a rich lady, while on a visit to Cornelia, showed her some magnificent jewels. When they had looked them over, the lady said, "These jewels are my jewels. Now let me see yours." Just at that moment Tiberius and Caius, who were then boys, came into the room. As soon as she saw them, Cornelia called them to her, and, putting her arms around them, said, "These jewels are my jewels." When Tiberius and Caius grew up to be men, they took the side of the people in a quarrel that had been going on for a long time between the plebeians and the nobles. The quarrel was about land. Whenever the Romans conquered a country in war, they took possession of a portion of the land of the conquered country. Such land was called public land, and for many years after the founding of the city, the custom of dividing parts of the public lands among all the citizens was strictly observed. But in later times this custom was changed. Instead of part of the public land being divided among all the citizens, it was divided among only the nobles, and the plebeians got none at all. The lands were tilled by slaves, and all that was raised went to the nobles. So the poor soldiers who won the lands by hard fighting were without farms to till, and some of them even without homes. They continually demanded that the old law for a fair division of lands among all the citizens should be carried out. The nobles laughed at the demand. But Tiberius Gracchus came forward boldly as the champion of the poor. He declared that the nobles should give up the land they had unjustly taken, and that the people should have their fair share. His words made the nobles very angry, and they became his bitter enemies. But the people honored Tiberius and made him one of their tribunes. The tribunes were supposed to look after the people's interests, but sometimes they were not faithful to their duty. As we have already said, they had a great deal of power. They could sit at the door of the Roman Senate, and when a law was proposed that they did not like, they could say, "We veto it," and then the law could not be passed. Whenever the tribunes wanted a law passed, they proposed it at the meeting of all the people in what was called the Assembly of Tribes. The common people had a great deal of power in this assembly, and any law proposed by the tribune was generally passed. Then the tribunes had the power to compel the consuls to carry out the law. Not long after Tiberius Gracchus became tribune, he proposed a law that each noble might have 500 acres of the public land for his own use, and 250 more for each son, and that the remainder of the lands should be equally divided among the poor citizens. This law was passed, and then the nobles had to give up a large part of the lands they had seized, so the poor citizens got good farms. About this time Attalus, the king of Pergamus, a country of Asia, died, leaving all his money to the Romans. The nobles tried to get this money for themselves, but Tiberius had it divided among the poor citizens. Of course this made the nobles still more angry with Tiberius, and they resolved to get rid of him if they could. So on election day, when the people were voting to make Tiberius tribune for a second term, some nobles went to the voting place and raised a disturbance, but the friends of Tiberius drove them away. Then the nobles started to report that Tiberius was trying to induce the people to make him king. Afterwards they gathered their friends and slaves and began fighting with the people. No arms were used, but stones were thrown, and sticks, broken benches, and other things hastily caught up served as weapons. There was a dreadful tumult for a while, and many persons were killed. Tiberius was in the midst of his friends bravely defending himself against an attack by a party of nobles, when suddenly he stumbled and fell to the ground. In a moment the nobles rushed upon him. One of them struck him on the head with a piece of wood and killed him. Then they took his body and threw it into the Tiber. Tiberius was now out of the way, and the nobles began to seize the lands that had been divided among the people. But Caius Gracchus suddenly appeared in Rome and declared that he had come to take his brother's place as the friend of the people. He had been with a Roman army in Spain when Tiberius was killed. The people now elected him tribune, and he began to carry out his brother's plans. For this reason the nobles hated him as much as they had hated his brother. They said that he was a dangerous man and was planning to make himself king. One day, as he was passing through the Forum, a strange man said to him, "I hope you will spare the Republic." The friends of Caius were angry at these words, and they fell on the man and killed him. The nobles and their followers then armed themselves. The plebeians also gathered in great numbers, ready for a fight. Caius was asked to lead them, but refused. He did not want them to fight with the nobles. He knew that the nobles would be satisfied with his own death, so he ordered a slave to stab him to the heart. The order was obeyed, and thus perished the last of the Gracchi. End of chapter 17. The Gracchi.
Of the famous men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Christopher. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A. B. Poland. Chapter 18. Marius.
1.
At the time of the death of Gaius Gracchus, there was in Rome a great man named Gaius Marius. This man came forward and said to the people that if they would elect him tribune, he would get them their rights. The people elected him tribune, and, true to his word, he did everything he could to improve their condition.
He was afterwards elected consul 7 times, and for a long while he was the greatest man in Rome.
Marius was a tall and very powerful man, and had a strong will. When he said he would do anything, he would do it, in spite of all difficulties. He was a very great soldier. Many people thought him the best of the Roman generals. He succeeded in a war against Jugurtha, king of Numidia, after other generals had failed. He took many cities from Jugurtha, and at last captured the king himself and all his treasure. Jugurtha was brought to Rome, and compelled to walk behind the chariot of Marius in a grand triumphal procession. he was afterwards put into a foul dungeon and left there to die. The nobles did not like Marius.
He was the son of plebeian parents, and he had taken the side of the plebeians against the nobles. Therefore the nobles hated him, and they would have done everything they could against him, only that they needed his help to protect Rome from very dangerous enemies.
A host of barbarian people, called Cimbri, Teutones, and Ambrones, had left their homes on the shores of the Baltic Sea and invaded the southern lands. They were strong, fierce men, and they laid waste every country they passed through. They defeated several Roman armies that were sent against them. Some of the tribes of Helvetia, the country now called Switzerland, joined them, and one of those tribes defeated and killed a Roman consul and made his army pass under the yoke. The Romans were, therefore, very much frightened. They thought that the barbarians would soon be in Italy, so Marius was appointed to go against them with a great army. He crossed the Mediterranean into Gaul and met the Teutones and Ambrones near the city of Arles on the river Rhone. The Cimbri had already gone to Italy. Marius first made a strong entrenched camp. He wanted to give his men time to get accustomed to the manners of the strange enemy before attempting to fight them. The Roman soldiers had shown fear at the sight of the barbarians. They had never before seen such people. The Teutones were like giants. They had large, wild, staring eyes and long hair, and they made terrible war cries. The Ambrones and the Cimbri were as savage in appearance. The king of the Teutones was very tall and so active that he could leap over 6 horses placed abreast. When the barbarians saw that the Romans would not fight, they began to taunt and insult them. They walked up and down in front of the Roman camp day after day, calling the soldiers cowards. "Why won't you come out and fight us like men?" they cried. "Are you afraid? Come out, we are in a hurry. We are going to Rome after we kill you." Marius had hard work to keep his men from rushing out upon the barbarians. He did not yet want to fight, but he said to his soldiers, "When the proper time comes, we will give these savages all the fighting they want." One day a gigantic Teuton chief with a long shield and spear came up to the very entrance of the Roman camp and called loudly for Marius himself to come out and fight. The great general laughed heartily at the impudence of the barbarian, and he sent out a gladiator to fight with him in order to give sport to the Romans. Gladiators were men who fought one another in the shows at Rome for the amusement of the people. They were usually slaves and were very strong, active, and well-trained fighters. It did not take the gladiator long to defeat the Teuton. In a few minutes he laid the savage giant low, and the Romans shouted with joy at the sight. After the Teuton was killed, the Romans still remained in their camp. Marius was not yet prepared to fight. At last the barbarians got tired waiting, and they started off to march to Italy. 2. So great was the number of the barbarians that it took them 6 whole days to march past the Roman camp. When all had passed, Marius left his camp and followed them by slow marches. Before long the 2 armies arrived at the city of Aix on the south coast of Gaul. Marius thought it was now time to fight, so he led out his fine army against the enemy. The first battle was fought with the Ambrones. They astonished the Romans with their war cry. They held their shields upright and at a little distance from their mouths, and shouted, "Ambrones, Ambrones," as if to terrify the Romans by letting them know who they were. Then they rushed furiously across the field. The Romans met the charge with wonderful courage. Their lines were scarcely broken. 3 times they drove back the enemy, and then they themselves moved steadily forward with their whole force. They cut down the Ambrones by thousands, took many prisoners, and sent the others fleeing away in terror. Next day there was another battle. The Teutones and Ambrones together attacked the Romans, but the Romans were again victorious. When the battle was over, it was found that more than 100,000 barbarians had been killed or taken prisoners. Marius now turned his attention to the Cimbri, who had gone to Italy. They had encamped on a beautiful, fertile plain near the river Po, and were enjoying the warm Italian sun and the sweet fruits of the country. But Marius was not very long in reaching the same place with his victorious army. When the Cimbri saw the Romans marching on to the plain where they were encamped, they were astonished. To gain time, they sent a messenger to Marius to ask him to give them lands to live on in Italy. "Give us," said the messenger, "lands in Italy for ourselves and for our friends, the Teutones and Ambrones, and we will all live in peace." "Never mind the Teutones and Ambrones," said Marius. "They have lands already. We have given them some which they will keep forever. We will give you the same." Then a battle began between the 2 great armies. The foot soldiers of the Cimbri were formed into an immense square, and the men in the front ranks were chained to one another by iron chains so that they could not run away. There were 15,000 horsemen, wearing on their helmets the heads of wild beasts. The battle was a hard one for a while, but it did not continue long. Time after time the Cimbri were driven back, and at last they were put to flight. Thousands of them were killed, and thousands made prisoners. When Marius and his soldiers returned to Rome, they got a splendid reception. There was a parade through the streets, and a great feast was given to the people. A large sum of money was divided among the soldiers to reward them for their brave conduct. Marius was now in high favor at Rome. The nobles did not dare to speak a word against him. He was elected consul 7 times, so that he was master of the republic for a long time. In the 6th year that Marius was consul, the war called the Social War broke out. It lasted for 3 years. It was a war with some of the nations of Italy, which Rome had formerly conquered. The people of those nations did not want to separate from Rome, but they wanted to have the right of voting as the Romans themselves had. Rome refused to give them this right, and at last they resolved to go to war. All the greatest Roman generals of the time took part in this war. One of them was a young noble named Sulla. He was a very successful soldier and won a number of great victories. The nations were defeated in the war, but Rome soon granted them most of the rights they had asked for. The nobles gave great praise to Sulla for his victories in the Social War. They declared that he was a better general than Marius. So many fine things were said about the young noble that Marius became jealous and did a very foolish thing. He suddenly left his army in the field and came back to Rome. He complained that he was nervous, and he shut himself up in his house and refused to see any of his friends for weeks. The nobles then started a story that Marius was getting silly and weak-minded from old age. He was about 70 at this time, and the nobles said he ought to retire from the army. This made the old hero angry, and he declared that he was as strong in mind and body as any of the young Romans. One morning he went to the place where the young men of Rome used to practice athletic sports, and for 2 or 3 hours he wrestled and ran and leaped with as much skill and strength as anyone. Some of the nobles who happened to pass by saw him and were very much amused. About this time Sulla was elected consul on account of his victories in the Social War. Shortly afterwards Rome declared war on Mithridates, king of Pontus in Asia Minor, who had cruelly put to death a number of the citizens of a Roman province in Asia. The Senate appointed Sulla to command the Roman army in this war, but as soon as he left Rome with his army, one of the tribunes proposed at an assembly of the people that the command should be taken from him and given to Marius. The assembly agreed to this, and Marius accepted the appointment. He sent word to the army, which was not far from Rome, that he would come in a short time to take command. When Sulla heard this, he became very angry. He called his soldiers around him, told them what had been done, and asked them if they would submit to be the slaves of Marius and his party. "No, no," cried the soldiers, "we will not submit. We want you for our general." "Then follow me to Rome," said Sulla. "We will teach Marius and his friends that they must not insult us." So the soldiers marched quickly back to Rome with Sulla at their head. They declared that they would take the city out of the hands of rebels, as they called the friends of Marius. When they entered the city, they were met by Marius and his followers, and there was a battle, in which Marius was defeated. Then a law was passed declaring Marius a traitor, and that he should be put to death. But Marius fled from Rome with some friends, and went down the Tiber in a boat to the Mediterranean. He sailed along the coast, and then he and his companions went ashore to seek for food. They wandered through the country for some time without seeing anyone. At last they met a farmer, who gave them something to eat. He told them that horsemen from Rome were riding through the place searching for Marius. They were frightened at this, and they ran into a thick wood where they stopped all night. But while his companions were downcast, Marius was cheerful and hopeful. "This bad state of things," he said, "will only last a short time. I know it, because the gods have revealed to me that I shall be once more consul of Rome." But next day Marius was taken by the horsemen. He saw them coming, and waded far into a great marsh, and hid himself among some high, thick reeds. The horsemen rode into the marsh and found him, and they put a rope around his neck and dragged him to the shore. Then they shut him up in a hut and began to think what they should do with him. At last they decided to put him to death at once. They thought this would please Sulla, and that perhaps he would reward them for it. So they gave a sword to a slave and sent him in to kill Marius. The slave entered the hut and stood for a few moments looking at the great general. Marius glared at him like a wild beast and said in a stern voice, "Slave, will you dare to kill Gaius Marius?" The slave stared back in terror and ran out of the hut. Then he threw down his sword at the feet of the soldiers and cried out that he could never have the courage to slay Marius. It was now decided to send Marius out of the country, so he was taken to a ship and carried to Africa.
After going ashore he wandered through the country until he came to the place where Carthage once stood. Nothing now remained of the famous city but a mass of gloomy ruins, for the Romans had entirely destroyed it a few years before in the Third Punic War. In these ruins Marius lived for a short time. One day a soldier came to tell him that the governor of Africa wanted him to leave the country. "Go to your governor," answered Marius, "and tell him that you saw Gaius Marius sitting on the ruins of Carthage." Not long afterwards, when Sulla was away fighting King Mithridates, there was great trouble at Rome. One of the consuls named Cinna, aided by many of the plebeians, attempted to get the control of public affairs, but was defeated by the nobles. Then Cinna and his followers were forced to leave the city. They organized an army among the Italians who had been complaining of not getting their rights from Rome, and they sent to Africa for Marius to come and be their commander. When Marius arrived, he made an attack on Rome and soon captured it. Then he marched in through the gates at the head of his army and took possession of the city. At the next election, the people elected him consul. Marius now resolved to have vengeance on the nobles who had driven him from Rome. And for several days the old Roman, surrounded by a guard of freed slaves, went through the city seeking the nobles in their houses, in the temples, in the forum, and everywhere that they could be found, and killing them without mercy. These were dreadful days. Some of the noblest men of Rome were put to death. None of Sulla's friends was spared. Even his wife and children were harshly treated and forced to leave the city. Marius did not stop the bloody work until he had killed all his enemies that he could find. But his triumph was short. He died in a little more than 2 weeks after he had become consul for the 7th time. End of chapter 18.
Chapter 19 of the Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by James Christopher. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 19. Sulla. 1. We have had something to say of Sulla, but there is much more to be told about him, for he was a very remarkable man, and he did remarkable things in Rome. His full name was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. He belonged to a very noble family. When he was a young man he was very fond of study, and became an excellent scholar. He was also a good speaker, and often made eloquent speeches in the forum on public affairs. He was a large, strong man, with red hair and a ruddy face. He was a very great soldier, and one of the greatest of Roman generals. They called him the Lion, he was so brave in battle, and he was so successful in war that he also got the name of Felix, a Latin word which means happy or fortunate. 2. One of the greatest wars that Sulla was in was a war against the Greeks. Rome had conquered Greece some time before, and the governors of many of the Greek cities were Romans. These governors were very cruel to the Greeks, therefore the people hated them. Mithridates, king of Pontus, knew this, and he offered to send armies to Greece to help to drive the Romans out of the country. The Greeks were very glad of this, and they prepared for war against the Romans. Sulla arrived in Greece with a strong army and began a march through the country. He captured several of the cities and compelled them to submit to the Roman governors. Then he marched on to Athens, the capital city of Greece, but he found that it was occupied by Archelaus, one of the generals of King Mithridates, who had brought from Asia Minor an army to help the Greeks. Athens at this time was one of the most strongly fortified cities in the world. Its walls were 70 feet high, and they were made of huge, thick blocks of hard, smooth stone. It took thousands of men many years to build these massive walls. The city was also well supplied with food, so that it could hold out against a siege for a long time. For several weeks Sulla attacked Athens furiously day by day, but it was all in vain. He could not take the city. His soldiers tried many times to mount the high walls, but they could not do it. At last Sulla had battering rams made. These were engines for breaking down the walls of towns. They were long, heavy beams of wood, with iron at one end, formed like the head of a ram. This was why they were called battering rams. At first they were worked by men with their hands and bodily strength. In later times they were hung from a crossbeam, so as to swing back and forward, and the iron end was made to strike against the wall with great force. When a number of battering rams were ready,
Sulla began another attack on Athens, but at dead of night a party of Athenians came out of the city and burned all the battering rams. Sulla quickly had new ones made, and after months of hard labor the Romans at last succeeded in breaking down the walls and taking Athens. They plundered the beautiful city and destroyed many fine works of art. It is said that they carried off more than 600 pounds of gold and silver. Sulla remained in Athens only long enough to establish Roman authority there once more. Then he departed with his army and marched to Chaeronea, another town of Greece, where there was a force of 120,000 men, which King Mithridates had sent to help the Greeks. The Romans numbered only about 40,000 men, but Sulla was not afraid to fight the immense army of Mithridates. By placing his troops in good positions at the beginning of the battle, and afterwards by moving them skillfully from one point to another, he was able to win a great victory. This was a remarkable battle in one respect. Although there were furious charges and hand-to-hand combats in which thousands upon thousands of the soldiers of Mithridates were slain, the Romans lost only a few men. We are told that when the roll call of the Roman army took place after the battle, only 12 men failed to answer to their names. The army of Mithridates had lost 110,000 men, the Romans only 12 men. But perhaps we ought not to believe that so very few Romans were killed, for it seems hardly possible that it could have been so. It is certain, however, that Sulla gained a great victory. He also defeated another army sent by Mithridates soon afterwards. Then Archelaus, the general of the army of Mithridates, begged for peace. Sulla made terms that were very good for Rome, and Archelaus and Mithridates had to accept them. Mithridates had to give the Romans a large sum of money and 70 ships of war, and to promise to be the friend of Rome in future. Thus the war with Greece ended. 3. Sulla now prepared to return to Italy. He had heard how his friends in Rome and his wife and children had been treated by Marius. He was greatly enraged, and in his letter to the Senate, telling them of his victories in Greece, he said, "In return for my services, which have brought honor and glory to Rome, my wife and children have been driven from their home, my house has been burned, and my friends have been put to death. I am now going back to punish those who did these things." When the letter was read to the senators, they were very much alarmed, for they knew that if Sulla did as he threatened, it would cause a dreadful civil war in Rome. In reply to Sulla, they begged him not to make war on his own countrymen, and they promised to do their best to bring about a friendly understanding between him and the followers of Marius. Sulla answered that he did not want any understanding with them. "I want no friendship with my enemies," he said. "I am able to take care of myself. It will be well for them if they can take care of themselves." Soon afterwards he set out for Italy with his army. Rome was then under the power of the Marian party. This party was led by Cinna and by Marius the Younger, the son of the great Marius. When they heard that Sulla was coming, they raised an army and went forth to drive him back. Young Marius said, "Now it will be decided who shall be the master of Rome." A battle was fought between the two armies. It was long and severe, and for a time it seemed as if the Marians would win. Even Sulla himself had no hope of victory. But soon very bad blunders made by the Marians turned the tide of battle in his favor, and he was victorious. He took 6,000 prisoners. 4. Sulla now entered Rome as its master, and a cruel master he proved to be. He first got himself appointed dictator for as long a time as he wished to hold the office. Then he commanded that all the followers of Marius should be slain. So they were hunted out of their hiding places and all put to death without mercy. When every person that was known to have been connected with the Marian party was killed, the people thought Sulla would cease his murderous work, but he did not. He went on killing this one and that one, now a poor man, and then a rich man, until at last the Romans became dreadfully frightened. "When will he stop?" they said to one another in trembling tones. One day a senator had the courage to ask Sulla if he would please to say whom he intended to spare from death. Sulla coolly answered, "I have not yet made up my mind, but if it is the wish of the Senate, I will shortly make out a list of persons who must die." And Sulla really did make out a list of persons he intended to kill. It was called a proscription list, and was hung up in the Forum. Oh, how anxiously the poor terror-stricken Romans went to that list to read the names. And if a man saw that his name was not there, he went away with joy in his heart. But if his name was there, he covered his face with his toga and ran off to hide himself. The next day another and longer list of proscribed persons was hung up, and the day after still another list. Anyone who killed a proscribed person got a large reward in money, but if anybody helped the proscribed person to escape, he was punished by death. This dreadful work was continued until many thousands of people in Rome and throughout Italy were slain. Then Sulla had his triumph in the streets of Rome. It was the most magnificent procession that had yet been seen in the city. There were hundreds of beautiful horses drawing bright golden chariots. There were long lines of soldiers in glittering armor. There were numbers of slaves, and there were huge wagons containing gold and silver and other precious things, which Sulla had got in Greece after his victories over Mithridates. The dictator himself rode in the most splendid chariot of all. He seemed like a king, and indeed was a king in power, though not in name. This was what was called a triumph. Sulla, for his own protection, had a bodyguard formed of slaves who had belonged to the people he had proscribed and put to death. This bodyguard is said to have numbered 10,000 men, and they were called Cornelii, after Sulla's family name. Under the rule of Sulla, his own will was law. He could do whatever he pleased. But he did not remain dictator a long time. In about a year after his triumph, he seemed to have gotten tired of ruling, and resigned the office. Then he left Rome and went to reside in his country house on the beautiful bay of Naples. Here he spent the rest of his life, passing his time partly in feasting and merriment, and partly in study. He died 78 B.C. End of Chapter 19. The Famous Men of Rome. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James Christopher. Famous Men of Rome by John H. Haaren and A.B. Poland. Chapter 20. Pompey the Great. 1. Not long after the death of Sulla, a new enemy to Rome appeared upon the Mediterranean Sea. A large number of people who lived on the coast of Asia Minor built and armed fleets of ships, sailed along the shores of Italy, and attacked and plundered Roman vessels. The sea rovers, or pirates as the Romans called them, had more than 1,000 well-built, fast-sailing ships. Many of them were adorned with richly gilded bows and sterns, purple sails, and silver-mounted oars. They seized trading vessels, robbed them, and killed every person on board. Often, too, the pirates committed robberies on land. A boat's crew from a pirate ship would go ashore, put to death all the farmers in the neighborhood, and lay waste their farms. So, in a short time, the pirates made themselves masters of the Italian coasts, and kept the people in constant excitement and terror. But at last the Romans resolved to make war upon the robbers, and selected a very popular young man named Gnaeus Pompey to be the general. The people had great confidence in Pompey. They said that he was the only one who could put down the Mediterranean pirates, and demanded that he should be sent to do the work. Pompey was a fine-looking man, with very pleasant manners. He had made himself famous as a soldier by brave deeds in wars in Spain and Africa, and was generally called Pompey the Great. His father had been a great commander, and the boy had lived in camps and taken part in wars almost from childhood. He had had many adventures during his army life, and had always shown the qualities of a hero. He fought on the side of Sulla in many battles against the Marians, and he was thought to be one of Sulla's greatest generals. The Roman Senate, therefore, yielded to the demand of the people and appointed Pompey to go forth against the pirates. He accepted the command and promptly set to work to carry out the important undertaking. He gathered 14 powerful fleets. He kept one of them for himself and put the others under the command of good officers. Then he divided the Mediterranean into 13 districts, and sent a fleet to each district to hunt the pirates. With his own fleet, he sailed as far as the Strait of Gibraltar, and then turned back towards Italy. On the way he chased the pirate vessels before him as he met them, until they were stopped and seized by some of the 13 fleets stationed here and there all over the Mediterranean. The pirates were thus caught in a trap. Thousands of them were killed in battles with the different fleets, and their vessels were burned. The remainder soon surrendered to the Romans, and in 3 months the sea was cleared of pirates. Pompey was much praised for this great work, and the people said he was just the man to take charge of the war against Mithridates. This king had again attacked a Roman province in Asia, and the Romans resolved to punish him. But Mithridates was a very powerful man. He had great armies. He was a skillful general, and he defeated the Romans in many battles. The Roman people, therefore, resolved to send Pompey against him. Pompey was much pleased to be placed in command of a great army, and he proudly started off with his soldiers for the eastern lands. 2. Pompey remained in Asia several years and won many great victories. He conquered a number of countries and put Roman governors over them. Then he came back to Rome, bringing kings and princes as prisoners, and an enormous amount of gold and silver and other valuable things to enrich the Republic and himself. He was welcomed in a magnificent manner, and he had a triumph such as was given to great and victorious generals. But Pompey now began to think of making himself master of Rome during his lifetime. He had greatly pleased the people by his victories in war, and they were praising him on every side. How to keep their favor, and by it to get power, was now what occupied his mind. He had been consul before, but he was now elected again, and then he set about providing various sorts of amusements for the people. He believed that if the people were amused, they would be less likely to object to his taking the powers of the government entirely into his own hands. He built a theater large enough to seat 40,000 persons. This was the first great theater erected in Rome. It was of stone and very strongly made. It had no roof, and the rows of seats rose one above another in a half circle. At one end there was an immense stage on which all the performances took place. In this grand theater Pompey gave some very wonderful exhibitions from time to time. He had lions, elephants, and other wild animals brought from Asia and Africa at great expense. These animals were let loose upon the stage, and gladiators fought them in full view of the people in the theater. There were also thrilling combats in the theaters between the gladiators themselves. They fought each other savagely until one was wounded and fell upon the stage. Then the victor would turn towards the audience to find whether they wished him to kill the wounded man. If the people wanted this, they would stretch out their hands with the thumbs down. If they did not want him killed, they would hold their thumbs upward. If he had shown skill and courage and fought well, they would give the sign to let him live. But if he had not made a brave fight, they would turn down their thumbs, and the unfortunate man would be instantly killed. Slaves and prisoners taken in war were taught to be gladiators in schools established for the purpose. There were hundreds of these trained fighters always ready for the combats. The Romans were very fond of such amusements, and great crowds of men, and women too, attended the theater whenever there was a fight of gladiators. By giving the people a great deal of amusement of this kind on a grand scale, Pompey became the great popular favorite in Rome, and while the people were entertained at his theater, he managed the government to suit himself. 3. At this time the Romans ruled a vast territory, which included not only all Italy, but Greece, Spain, Syria, Egypt, Turkey, Switzerland, and parts of France and Germany. Country after country had been conquered during a long series of years, and millions of people of different races and languages were subjects of Rome. Rome itself was a city with a population of about 500,000. It covered a very large area, including the famous 7 hills. Its streets were narrow and crooked, but well paved and clean. In the center of the city were a number of large squares in which there were handsome buildings. There were magnificent temples and baths, and the houses of the nobles and wealthy plebeians were very large and splendid. Many of the fine houses were built of marble, with great pillars in front. Elegant furniture and handsome carpets and rugs filled the rooms. There were many rich men in Rome at this time. Most of them had obtained the greater part of their wealth by plundering the conquered countries. They lived in a very magnificent manner, gave splendid dinners and entertainments, and had hundreds of slaves to attend upon them. The slaves were a large class who were brought to Rome from many nations conquered in war. Many of them belonged to high families in their own country and were well educated. Some of them were physicians, and others were good scholars, and could read and write for their masters. The best cooks, builders, tailors, and farmers were slaves. In fact, it was by slaves that nearly all the skilled work in Rome was done. There were markets in Rome where slaves were sold. The slaves to be sold were placed on a platform, labels hung from their necks, showing their age and what they were able to do. The Roman children were taught to read and write Latin, which was their own language. They were also taught arithmetic and history. Most of the teachers were well-educated slaves. Rome, then, was very rich and very powerful in the time of Pompey, and for many years Pompey was very popular. At one time he became dangerously ill while visiting Naples. Then the people showed their great love for him in many ways. and when he recovered there were public thanksgivings throughout Italy. On his journey home, great crowds came out to greet him as he passed through the towns, and when he arrived at Rome he was received with unbounded joy. Pompey had now a very strong hold on the affections of the people, so he cared little for the efforts made by a very ambitious Roman named Julius Caesar to win public favor. But Caesar was a man of strong will and great energy. He had resolved to be the ruler of Rome, and he spared no labor to accomplish his purpose. Pompey at last became alarmed at Caesar's efforts, but it was then too late. He was defeated by Caesar in a great battle, and soon after lost his life. How these things came about we shall learn in the next story. End of chapter 20.